After 9/11, and everybody far from these claims of Islam and Muslims being persecuted in America after 9/11, it's just been the opposite. Americans have bent over backwards to be welcoming and open to Muslims. I mean, they've been so open-minded about it, their brains have fallen out.
Sometimes I feel the weight of the world fall down on me so heavy, and I need a friendly voice with some good theology. Calvinistically speaking, so I mix a manly drink, Pepsi and shoe polish, and I hit the YouTube link. Don't say hit, that sounds violent. And I feel my troubles all melt away. It's your Calvinist podcast with Keith Foskey. Beards and bow ties, laughs till sunrise. It's your Calvinist podcast with Keith Foskey. He's not like most Calvinists, he's nice.
And welcome back to Your Calvinist Podcast. My name is Keith Foskey, and I am your Calvinist. So thankful to have you with me on the show today, and I'm looking forward to introducing you to today's guest. But before I do that, I just have a few announcements that I need to make. Many of you watch our Friday night live show, and you know I've been talking about our new Bible reading program that we put out for 2025. It's a chronological reading through the Gospels. We're going to do a walking with Jesus through 2025, reading through the Gospels 3 times, twice chronologically, and 1 straight through Matthew through John. And you can find that at my website, keithfoskey.com. Also, if you have questions you'd like for me to address either on our Friday night live show or on our new show, Theology from a Golf Cart, you can also send those questions in to keithfoskey.com. Last thing before we move on is my reminder to you that this coming weekend, I'm going to be at the Reformation Conference, which is being hosted by Paramount Church here in Jacksonville, Florida. Pastor John Fonville is putting this on. He's going to have a group of terrific speakers talking about the 5 solas, and he's offered me the opportunity to come in and interview his speakers, so I'm looking forward to that and sharing those interviews with you. And if you're in the Jacksonville area and you want to participate in the conference, you can get all of the information about it in a description in the link below. I'm also going to be showing a video on it a little bit later in today's program. Hey guys, I want to take just a moment to remind you about the sponsors that we have for today's show. The first one is our longest running sponsor, tinybibles.com. You can go and find the smallest printed Bible on the market. It's available in King James, New King James, and very soon in the New American Standard Bible. And you can find it at tinybibles.com and use my name, Keith, in the coupon code, and you'll get a discount off. Also, if you're looking to go deeper in your study of theology and doctrine, I encourage you to pick up the book, What Do We Believe? From Striving for Eternity Ministries. The link will also be in the description, and you can also get a percentage off if you use my name, Keith, in the coupon code. Also want to introduce you to our newest sponsor, and that is High Calling Fitness. High Calling Fitness provides health, training, and nutrition coaching, all delivered to you online. They invite you to join a group of like-minded people, all improving their physical health and strength, and it's exclusively coached by confessionally reformed bodybuilders and strength athletes. They'll meet you where you are and help you achieve your fitness goals. Learn how to book a meeting in the link in the description of this video. All right, guys, let's get back to the show. Guys, my guest today is Dr. Timothy Furnish. He is a Lutheran Christian with a PhD in Islamic world and African history from Ohio State. He's a former U.S. Army Arabic linguist and later a civilian consultant to the U.S. Special Operations Command. He's author of books on the Middle East and Middle Earth, history professor, and sometimes media opiner. He has been on Fox News' War Stories, Fighting ISIS, and he's also a huge Shakespeare fan, occasional thespian, and he fences with a saber, and he says usually left-handed. Dr. Furnish, thank you for being on the program today.
Thank you, Pastor. I hope there's some Princess Bride fans in the audience.
Yes, Absolutely, absolutely. I have a quick thing I wanted to mention about that as I was reading your description. I actually, as many people know, I teach karate, but I also have a training in a martial art called modern arnis, which is a
Hmm.
Filipino stick and machete fighting art, which is
Hmm.
similar to fencing, has some of the same principles. And my teacher's teacher was a man by the name of Remy Priestas. He was from the Philippines, and someone once asked him, Professor Priestas, if you were in a real fight, what would you do? And the first thing he did was he put the stick in his left hand because he
Uh-huh.
was left-handed. And he said,
Hmm.
he said, if I was really doing it, I would put it in my left hand because it throws everybody off.
He knew something you didn't know.
What's that?
He knew something you didn't know.
Oh,
He
yes, yes, exactly.
he,
Yeah,
he was left-handed. Sorry,
yeah,
channeling Inigo Montoya there from the movie. So,
yes, absolutely, absolutely. Well, sir, I want to thank you again for being on the show and coming in to talk about something that you specialize in. I even mentioned that you were going to be on the show from the pulpit recently
oh,
because I was talking about, I mentioned Islam in one of my sermons for, I don't even remember the reason, but I said, I'm looking forward to having an expert in Islamic studies come in. And I noticed in your bio, I didn't say it, but I noticed as I was looking at it that you received your doctorate in 2001,
hmm,
which obviously is a very important, significant year because that is also the year of 9/11. And
hmm.
so I have a question just to kind of get things started. I know that after 9/11, there was a huge spike in Islamic interest around the world because it was considered an Islamic terrorist attack. People saw that as something that was Islam's hatred of America or whatever, how people felt, and people wanted to know more about that. And there was this huge spike. But you obviously were studying Islam long before that event. So my first question to you is just what made you want to pursue that study, which obviously began in the 90s?
Right. Well, it really began in 1983 when I enlisted in the Army. At the height of the Cold War, I'd gone and done my, excuse me, I'd gone and done my undergraduate degree. I tried a year, actually a semester of law school, and I hated it with a white hot burning passion. So I thought, since they didn't have these nice loan forgiveness programs that we now see from the federal government, like how can I get my loans paid back and do something useful with an American Studies undergraduate degree? Um, and I had thought about being ROTC, and I just had never done it because at the time I had a beard which wasn't white, and I didn't want to shave it. Was one reason. It was kind of vain, but I was 21, so excuse me. So I decided to enlist in the Army, and at that time, when you enlisted for the intelligence job, which was interrogator, which I signed up for, you did not get to choose your language. Some of the jobs you could choose your language, electronic warfare, intercept jobs where the guys have the headphones and listen to the radios and such. But we didn't get to choose our language. I don't know why. The infinite wisdom of the DoD. I went through basic training, went through interrogation school, and then went out to Monterey, California. It's still Defense Language Institute, still the gigantic language training facility for all the DoD, as well as a lot of the three-letter agency folks go there now. Excuse me. And so there were 15 people in my interrogation class. 13 of them got Russian, 1983. It was the height of the Cold War, of course. One guy got Korean, and I was the only person that got Arabic, which was interesting. I mean, now, of course, the percentages are much different now. I mean, last time I checked, huge numbers of people were in Arabic and Persian and things like that. And of course, Korean is now also very, very valuable, but it was sort of a backwater language back then. But anyway, so that's how I learned Arabic. And then after my stint in the Army enlisted, I wanted to go to grad school. And by the way, speaking of more movies, I actually thought about going to grad school in archaeology. And I got in the University of Chicago, which of course is where Abner Ravenwood taught, Dr. Jones's mentor. But I found out that if you go to grad school in Chicago, A, you probably have to mortgage your entire future and sell several organs. And B, um, they don't issue a fedora and a whip if you get an archaeology degree with a diploma. So I thought, well, what the heck? So Ohio State said, hey, you can come here on a fellowship and we'll pay for school and give you just enough money to eat to live on. And I thought, well, that might be more useful anyway. So that's wound up doing my doctorate in Islamic history at Ohio State.
Nice. And yeah, I imagine there's a lot of people who got into archaeology because of those movies, and we're quite disappointed to find out that it's not quite what you see.
Right. You're not always fighting Nazis and arguing with your dad, probably.
Sure. Now, I mentioned earlier about obviously how the world changed in 2001. That's the year that I say I received my call to ministry was in 2001. I got saved in 2 years earlier in 99, and I preached my first sermon on the Sunday after 9/11. There's a long story that
Wow.
goes along with that, but certainly was life changing for me. Looking back, not only did it change the world, but it changed what God was doing in my life, or at least what I perceived God doing in my life. And I remember those first few years, everybody was talking about Islam. Everybody wanted to read the Quran. Everybody wanted to talk about, what would cause people to do the things that were done. And did you find yourself a hot commodity? I know that's a strange way of saying it, and I hope nobody is offended by that. But I mean, with those specialties, did you find yourself now at the forefront of people's what people were looking for, and people asking you questions and stuff?
Yeah, quite a bit. I mean, I was on Fox. You mentioned one. I was on Fox News quite a bit. That Fox hasn't had me on about 6 years since. And I think part of it is what you're talking about. I guess the world just kind of moved on, and uh, jihadist Islamic terrorism became just another staple of life, and not anything striking. Well, since they weren't killing as many Americans, at least in one fell swoop. And I think a lot of it too, the ideological lens, particularly from the government, changed. But we can talk more about that later if you want. But yeah, for a while there. I mean, interestingly, the year before 9/11 in 2000, I had published an entry in the Encyclopedia of Islam on Al Qaeda, on a fundamentalist Islam. Specifically, it was on fundamentalist Islam. Back when you were allowed to use that term, now they have all these sort of camouflage terms they use for it. But um, I had published an
Yeah, I
article in
actually,
this.
I don't want to interrupt you, but I am kind of interested in how YouTube is going to handle this video. I've thought about that today, and I'm going to publish straight out. I'm not going to change anything, but I am wondering how, like, with the words that we're using. Obviously, we're talking about Islamic fundamentalism. We're words like that.
Jihad.
Yeah, is that gonna pick up on the algorithm? But I'm just glad to get to talk to you. But you're right. Words change and how people interpret them, and now don't want to hear them for sure.
Right. And the prescribed list grows ever larger. I mean, maybe that's starting to reverse, but it has been. But no, you're right. Again, I published that article, and one of the people I talked about in that article in 2000, of course, before this all broke, was Osama bin Laden and
Hmm.
heading the group called Al Qaeda. And I mean, when I saw, like a lot of people, the first plane you see hit, you think, oh, well, that's some sort of pilot passed out, something happened, something's wrong. Second plane hit, you're like, no, that's intentional. There's no way that's not intentional. And I told my wife, I called her at work and I said, it's bin Laden. I bet you dollar to a donut, it's bin Laden.
Wow.
So, yeah, so there for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, actually probably up until, let's see, when Greta used to be on Fox. She
Hmm.
had me on a couple of times, and then there was that Ollie North's War Stories that you alluded to earlier, which was talking about ISIS, and I think that ran in 2014, 2015, something like that, 2016 maybe. But that's the last time. I used to also appear with Catherine Herridge. Catherine Herridge, who was a reporter at
Hmm.
Fox. She went to CBS. She recently was in the news um, because they wanted her to reveal her sources for some stories, her journalist sources, and she refused to do it. And she was in some legal issues about that. And anyway, but Catherine had me on. Remember Major Hassan, that killed the people at Fort Hood, the
Hmm.
army physician who was the Palestinian American guy. And actually, she had sent me, and that was what I think 2011. She had sent me his so called manifesto, and I broke it down, and she used a lot of that material on air. So yeah, so for a decade or so, uh, it was I was on quite a bit, and then that was about the same time. Let's see, 2008 to 2014. I worked at Special Operations as a civilian consultant down at McDale Air Force Base in Tampa. I would fly down there every so often, quite regularly, and work. mostly open source analysis. That is to say, they'd say, we need some research on this group. And I would just do open source, what I could find online. I'd go here. I live in the Atlanta area. I'd go to the Emory Middle East collection, Emory University, and look stuff up. And then plus I have a lot of stuff myself. So I did a lot of open source analysis for them. And then, but I think this is, if you want me to finish carrying on with this,
Sure.
There developed this, at some point, there developed this prohibition. I mean, Bush wasn't too bad about it, although we saw it somewhat with Bush too. Remember Bush's famous Islam as a religion of peace thing?
Yeah.
But it became, it quadrupled at least under Obama. And I think this bled back into the media too. So I had two other part-time jobs that I was doing in this period. One was both of them were lecturing jobs. I lectured at Joint Special Operations University, which is also in Florida, and it's a facility where higher enlisted and certain officers in the special operations community go for specialized training on different topics. And we also bring in foreign officers from foreign countries to come, allied countries. Egyptians, Pakistanis, a lot of those guys would come. And so that job, at one point, I regularly, like 2, 3, 4 times a year. And by the way, Seb Gorka, Sebastian Gorka, who was on media and was in the first the first Trump administration for a bit. Sebastian Gorka and I lectured right after one another on history of terrorism. And I did this for a couple of years, and then I was told that I wouldn't be brought back anymore. And I said, well, why? Well, then they wouldn't tell me. And finally said, look, come on. I've been coming here for years. Tell me the straight story. Well, the foreign Muslim officers are complaining you're talking about Islam too much. I'm like, well, you tell me to talk about the history of Islam, the history of terrorism. Of course, most modern terrorism is Islamic. I mean, if you go look at the U.S. State Department list right now, foreign terrorist organizations, 53 of 68 are Muslim. And again, that's not designations that, President Trump or Sean Hannity or some Christian pastor came up with. That's what the State Department says. So 78% of the world's terrorist groups, according to our State Department, are Muslim. I would be remiss if I did not talk about those. But, I also talked about other stuff. I talk about the French Revolution terrorism. I talk about Vlad the Impaler. I talk about the 5th of November, the gunpowder plot in England. It wasn't that. So anyway, but they were offended. So I think with the government, you get a lot of, we can't offend our Muslim allies. So, which I guess makes some sense. But on the other hand, who are the main victims of Islamic terrorism? They're other Muslims.
Yeah.
Muslims mainly kill other Muslims in these jihadist attacks. A lot of it's Sunni on Shia violence and vice versa, but mainly Sunni on Shia. So that was one. Basically, that was what happened with that. And then the other one was I had a regular lecturing job at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, which is down in Glencoe, Georgia, down past Savannah. It's the main training facility for Homeland Security, Transportation Security Agency. A lot of FBI guys go there and women. So it's a main training facility for domestic law enforcement and FBI related groups. So I'd lectured there for a couple of years. They'd invite me down every so often. I'd spend an entire afternoon lecturing about same sort of stuff, history. I do history of it. They wanted history of Islam. I do history of terrorism. And again, I didn't just talk about Islamic terrorism, and I would always make a point of saying, hey, not all Muslims are terrorists, not even remotely. Most Muslims are terrorists, thank the Lord. But however, I was told at one point, well, you won't be coming back anymore. Why? Well, this was during the Obama administration. Well, the Obama administration has sent the edict down from on high that any counterterrorism lecture that uses the word jihad will no longer be employed.
Wow.
So we can't talk about jihad, which is what the people engaging in it themselves call it.
Yeah.
I guess Barack Obama and Eric Holder and his coterie know more about Islam than Muslims themselves do. So I think with them, some of it is not offend our allies, but I think a lot of it's ideological. Ideological, and it comes from the left. It comes from the universities. And this is also, by the way, to more directly address your question, this, I think, bleeds a great deal into the journalistic ranks, because journalists, as we know, are almost, not entirely, but mostly left of center. They have a left of center worldview. The left of center worldview, unfortunately, in the last decade or two, has become not just traditional liberal, Harry Truman, John F. Kennedy, even Bill Clinton liberal. It has become Marxist. And one of the key tropes of Marxism, of course, is, well, oppressor and oppressed. Well, and then they have their hierarchy of oppression. And on the global scale, who do they consider to be the number one victims? Well, Muslims. And a lot of this is just, it's so two-dimensional and ridiculous. So Muslims are victims because they have brown skin. I'm like, do you know anything about Islam? First of all, many of the world's Muslims don't have brown skin. So I've been to Iran. The people in Iran are whiter than I am. And that's saying something. So it's just this two-dimensional sort of thing. And a lot of it became ideological. It is ideological. It wasn't just pragmatic, like I was saying, well, okay, we don't want to offend our Saudi allies or our Egyptian allies. Sure, okay, I can understand that. But, if I have a friend that has a problem, if I have a friend pulls up in his car and his engine is knocking, I don't, in order not to offend him, go, hey, you have a crappy car. No, I say, hey, buddy, you might want to get that engine fixed. I mean, I tend to think maybe that's just, naive of me, and that doesn't work at the highest levels, although, probably work with somebody like Trump, but with someone as sophisticated as President Obama, I don't know, we're not going to do that. We can't tell our friends they have problems. We're going to pretend like they don't. So anyway, a lot of this I also think bleeds over into the media. The media, it becomes sort of synergistic, right? The government, if you have particularly the Democrat administration, although some Republicans are guilty of it too, you have a Democrat administration says, well, don't say anything bad about Islam because Muslims are peaceful, or in fact, I'm just working on I'm giving a class this weekend at a local church. Pastor asked me to do it on the question is Islam a religion of peace? So I was putting some of that stuff together earlier today, and it's reminding me some things. Like, for instance, Pope Francis has repeatedly said Islam is not violent. I'm like, what? But you get that trope repeated. The media repeats it. The government says it, particularly someone as esteemed, particularly by the media, as Barack Obama. But George Bush said it too, to be fair. It's a religion of peace. And then the media latches onto that because that reinforces their preconceived notions, which is that all religions teach basically love your neighbor. I'm like, no, actually they don't. They don't do that. So it becomes a sort of self-reinforcing thing where that becomes the overriding narrative. And then, of course, what feeds into that is the stuff from the universities. I mean, again, I started my PhD. I started my doctorate in 91. I finished in 2001. Back then, though, you could say things. It wasn't as bad, but you could see where it was going. You could still say things like Islamic fundamentalist, which is what these people are. I mean, this is literally what they are. They read the Quran and go, oh, I'm going to do exactly what it says in the Quran. That makes them a fundamentalist. Anyway, we can get into that more in a bit, I guess. But now it's gotten to the point where in universities and even at the undergraduate level, not just graduate level, you can't speak honestly about this topic. I'll give you a quick example, Pastor. A week or so ago on Twitter, and if you see my Twitter feed, I reposted on this. There was a guy I follow on Twitter that said, why does all academic writing refer to Muhammad as the prophet? And I responded to him, and then I posted on it. I said, it's not just academic writing. I run into this with undergraduates. I teach world history surveys to undergraduates. And I cover Islam, and I don't disparage Islam. I don't run Muslims down, but I talk about it honestly. Okay, Muhammad engaged in jihad. You can't pretend he didn't. The Islamic sources say he engaged in jihad. A little different than Jesus, a little different than Buddha too. But that's on the other side of the theological discussion. But I mean, you want to compare Jesus and Muhammad? One guy engaged in jihad and ordered his enemies killed, and the other guy did the opposite. But I said, what you get is, first of all, the textbooks, the undergraduate textbooks, without fail, refer to Muhammad as the prophet with a capital P.
Wow.
And then I think that's a big part of it, especially for undergrads. But I teach master's level classes in non-Western military history, and I find graduate students doing it too. one reason is the textbooks say that, and the other one is because Americans, as I said in my X, whatever the verb form is of X, my tweet, I said Americans basically have been.
You confused me for a second, but yeah, you're
How do you
right.
make a verb
What
out
do
of
you call
X?
it?
I don't know.
Yeah, I still say tweet. I'm sorry, didn't mean to interrupt, but yeah.
No, I know. Yeah. In my tweet, I said the other part of this is that Americans basically have been inculcated. Actually, I used the term browbeaten. Americans have been browbeaten into being nice about Islam. Don't say anything bad about Islam. Don't, respect their. I'm like, look, and I tell my students flat out in class, you don't have to refer to Muhammad as the prophet unless you're a Muslim. If you're a Muslim, fine. I understand you want to do that. I just refer to Jesus as the Christ because I believe it. You believe it, that's fine. But if you but I don't tell Muslim students to refer to Jesus as the Christ. Christian students or secular students should not have to refer to Muhammad as the prophet. But a lot of them do it, and I tell them not to. It's like it's because it's so in the zeitgeist. It's so everywhere that Muhammad's the prophet. I'm like, no, he's not. Not a prophet unless you're a Muslim. He's not my prophet. So anyway, I'm sorry, that was a long-winded way of trying to answer your question. But I
No,
think
I actually want to go a little deeper because you said you were going to be at a church this week.
Mhm.
How often do churches, and especially I guess since 9/11, but even more recently, how often are you being invited in to talk to Christians about these things? It sounds like most of what you've done has been through military and police and things like
Mhm.
that.
Right. No, I've done quite a bit. Particularly in the conservative Lutheran circles, they would throw holy water on me at the ELCA, but if they had holy water, I'm sorry. For those of
Yeah.
you that don't know, there's a couple major divisions of Lutheranism. The ELCA is the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which is very, very, very liberal and basically indistinguishable now from the Episcopal Church. And then there's Missouri Synod and Wisconsin Synod, which are smaller but still substantial, which still dress like the guys when Pastor Foskey does the Lutheran on the videos. Drink beer before church? No, just after church.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, I know I do quite a bit.
And
I've
what
given
are you, if you don't mind me asking, what are you, Missouri Synod, or
Missouri Synod.
where you
Missouri
are? Okay.
Synod. Yeah.
Do you know Hans
Um,
Feeney?
I follow him. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
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 I mean, I don't know him personally. What's funny is he does those Lutheran satire videos, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So my sons both went to Catholic school. My sons went to evangelical school K through 8. Well, actually, they went to we had a K through 3 at our Lutheran church for a while, and then it died during the pandemic or thereabouts or somewhere. I don't know, before that, actually. So my sons went to a it was basically a Baptist K through 8. And then they had a very small high school. And like 90 kids. And our kids wanted to play football. And so we didn't want them to go there. So, excuse me. So they went to local Catholic school and played football and wrestled and things like that. But they went to Catholic school. It was funny. I'm getting ahead of myself, but I just thought of this because, let me tell you Hans Fine thing real quick. So one of my son's first, because you have to take 4 years of religion in Catholic high school. So my older son, he comes home and he goes, "Oh yeah, we watched this video today about the Trinity." I'm like, "Yeah." He goes, and he pulls it up. It was a Hans Fine video about the Trinity. And I'm like, "Oh, so the priest that's teaching this class is using Hans Fine stuff." It was really funny.
That's awesome.
But real quick, I'm going to tell you, when we applied to go to that school, and we visited Blessed Trinity here in Roswell, Georgia. We went through the tour, and I think there were wound up being 2 Lutheran families in the whole place. Most of them are Catholic, but there were some Baptists. But there were some Baptists on the tour with us, and and the priest came out and talked to us. Real nice guy, Father Rito. He came out and talked to us. I think he's Dominican or something. But anyway, he came out and he said, "Any questions?" And I said, "Yeah, Father." I said, "If my kids come here, do they have to promise not to nail anything on the front door?" And he started laughing. So I kid you not, one of the Baptist fathers leaned over to me and goes, "What are you talking about?"
Well, there is, obviously I'm a Baptist, but I know that sometimes within Baptist circles, there can be a very limited knowledge of church history. So
I'm sorry, that's just really funny. So
no,
I've been to, let's see, Lutheran churches, some Orthodox churches, so actually some Methodist churches, Mostly Lutheran because the circles, the pastors know me, but I've done quite a bit of that. Sorry, sort of to correct the misperception perhaps that I gave from earlier. It hasn't just been, it hasn't, and I actually, sorry, trying to say too much. It hasn't just been military and government circles. And I also been to a couple Lutheran conferences, and I also some years ago went up and gave a talk on this at Concordia Seminary, which is the main Missouri Synod seminary in St. Louis. So anyway, I've been, and then our district president, basically bishop, but we can't say that word in Missouri Synod. They'll throw holy water on you. Went down to Orlando, which is where our Florida Georgia district headquarters is, and I've given some classes down there on that. So it has been in church circles, not just in government circles. Of course, a little different approach.
Hi, my name's Justin Johnson.
And I'm Josiah Stowe.
And we are Dominion Wealth Strategists. We are created to put money in the hands of those that are sitting in the pews.
From budgeting to estate planning, savings accounts, retirement planning, life insurance, and a heck of a lot more here at Dominion.
That means that you are leaving an inheritance that passes multiple generations because that is the legacy. It's part of our mission.
All of Christ for all of life.
And all of finance for Christendom.
Hello friends, Pastor John here. It's often said that the first generation believes and proclaims the gospel, the next assumes it, and the third denies it. That's why rediscovering and proclaiming the core truths of the gospel is vital for every generation. So, I'm thrilled to invite you to the Reformation Conference, hosted by our church, Paramount Church, with the Wittenberg Center for Reformation Studies, this coming January 17th through the 19th, 2025. The theme of our conference is rediscovering and proclaiming the five solas today. 5 powerful truths that were reclaimed during the Protestant Reformation. Sola Scriptura, Scripture alone. Sola Gratia, grace alone. Sola Fide, faith alone. Solus Christus, Christ alone. And Soli Deo Gloria, to the glory of God alone. This conference promises to be a time of deep spiritual enrichment. We have the great privilege of having 5 top Reformation scholars who will guide us in rediscovering these foundational truths. I encourage you to bring your friends and bring your family, bring groups from your church. Now, our seats are filling up fast. I recommend registering as soon as possible to secure your spot. I look forward to welcoming you this coming January as we dive deeply into these gospel truths rediscovered by the Reformers, truths that continue to shape our faith today. I'll see you there.
Hello, this is Chuck from Private Family Banking. Thanks for joining us today. We help you make one money move in your cash flow, and it'll implicate itself into multi-generational wealth building starting the first day. We help you avoid taxation. We throw compound interest to your money. If you're a high net worth individual, you have over $10 million in net worth, we can even do more with you. W-2 workers, contract workers, business owners, it's all about cash flow and making tax-deferred gains on all of your money for the rest of your life. Don't avoid this. It's a big move. It's a great time. Never lose money. Always increase your money. Join us today. We're a community of people. You're not alone. Click the link, get on my calendar, and we'll go over your background and what you want to accomplish, and we're going to model a program to exactly fit your needs. Chuck at privatefamilybanking.com is my email, but click the link below. Make a free discovery call now. Thank you.
Where I want to go to now, I do want to talk about some of the theological side of Islam, and some of the questions I'm going to ask, I may already know the answer to because I've done a little study myself, but some of it may just be me clarifying some things, but also for the audience sake. You okay. Being an expert, I like to pick your brain a little bit. You wrote an article called "The Past, Present, and Future Dangers of the Islamic Belief in the Mahdi." I think I'm saying that correct. And you called Islam a Christian heresy. And you actually quoted I think it was a 6th or 7th century or 7th or 8th century church leader who also identified it as a heresy. And you said that Martin Luther identified it as a Christian heresy, and a few others. Um,
Mhm.
why is it a proper classification to say that Islam can be included as a Christian heresy?
Yeah, and again, remember that's not original man. That St. John of Damascus first came up with that. Yes,
Okay.
he was an expert. He lived under after Islamic conquest, under Islamic rule. Um, yeah, why is it a Christian heresy? I mean, that has long been a trope. That has long been a belief in a lot of Christian circles, particularly Catholic circles, until Vatican II in the '60s, when it became unfashionable to criticize Islam thusly.
Hmm.
Well, if you just look at it, I mean, just because B follows A doesn't mean A caused B. But if you look at the religious beliefs of Islam, they sure look like a lot of them were just copied from Christianity. And not just from mainstream Christianity. I mean, there's some Islamic beliefs that look like they were taken from some of the apocryphal gospels. The gospels that didn't, for instance, the gospels, writings that did not make it into the New Testament because they didn't meet the standards for canonization. Like there's a story in the so-called Gospel of Thomas in which Jesus does things like creates little clay birds. You probably know this. Creates little clay birds and throws them up in the air and they fly away, right? Well, that story verbatim is in the Quran. So unless Muhammad just somehow came up with that story on his own, I'm not buying that. It sounds like to me like he probably copied that from somebody, probably because there may have been heretical Christians, which is what the group that put that together were, living in the deserts of Arabia, and even the Islamic sources say there were Christians living in not just some in Mecca. Muhammad's first wife Khadijah was a Christian. But there was a substantial, and I've done some work years ago on the early Christian communities in the Arabian Peninsula. There was substantial community Christians in Najran, which is now in southern. We're talking Saudi Arabia, what is now Saudi Arabia. So, but the big thing is, if you just look at the beliefs, I mean, it's the timing and the beliefs and the locale. I mean, it just makes sense because it says there's a God, and Muslims claim that Allah is the same God that Jews and Christians worship. Their big claim is what? That they worship the same God, but that Jews were given revelation, what they call the Torah, they call the Torah with Moses. But then after 1,200 years, they messed it up. So then Jesus came with what Muslims call the Injil, which is their corruption of the term gospel, evangel. And then Jesus then had to fix things. And then, of course, it only took Christians, according to Muslims, half as long to screw it up, because in 600 years, they had to send Muhammad, and he's the final arbiter, the final revelation to mankind of what is right. But it's just so much of it is clearly aped, copied from Christianity. Belief in one God, prophets, some sort of eschatology, angels and demons, and of course the intermediate thing of jinn, which Christians don't have, but they have, which is clearly interjection from pre-Islamic Arabian belief systems, polytheistic belief systems. Excuse me. So I just think if you look at it, it looks like, and there's been a lot of work done on this by some early historians of Islam, who are, of course, whose names are anathema in the field, because although 20, 30, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, when I first started studying Islam, Patricia Crone and Martin Hines and people like that, their work was considered groundbreaking and really interesting. They would look at the early Islamic sources, and they'd look at the early Christian sources in Syriac and things like that, and say, well, look, this clearly comes from here. I mean, Muhammad or whoever put together the Quran, and most scholars worth their salt do not believe for a second Muhammad put the Quran together. Say, well, this clearly is borrowed from these sources. And there's, all these discussions about cognate languages and such, which we probably don't have time to go into, and I'm not an expert on anyway. But I just think if you just look at it overall, it's a monotheistic system that resembles Judaism and Christianity, particularly Christianity in many aspects, but yet changes things just enough so that it's a new religion. At least they claim it's a new religion. So I just think based on that, it's clearly, basically what I think happened is Muhammad came along, and I do think Muhammad was a real historical figure. I know there are people that have been trying. There have been books written. Robert Spencer, in particular, wrote a book, and there have been others, but saying that, well, Muhammad's not a real historical figure because we actually don't have any hard data about him. I always tell this my students in world history class. We have solid evidence that Jesus existed. All these internet atheists always try to say Jesus is made up. Just crack me up. I mean, golly, can you betray how ignorant you are anymore? I mean, Roman historians wrote about Jesus who weren't Christian, right? Tacitus, Suetonius, Josephus, who was Jewish. These guys wrote about Jesus. So Jesus is a real historical figure, and we have corroborating data. And we have lots of corroborating data. Also, we're getting more and more as time goes on for the early church and for things in Jewish history, right? Like David's been attested. We have epigraphic evidence of King David. So you don't have that with this law. There is no evidence outside of the Islamic sources that some guy named Muhammad ever existed. You just now, do I think
But
he
you're
did?
not,
Yeah,
but
I
you're
think
not, you personally are not questioning his existence. You're just saying that's why people hold
no.
that.
No, that's why people say that, because you don't have any attestation, no corroborating data, right? The Islamic sources say there was Muhammad, but we don't have anything. The Byzantine sources don't say anything. The Sasanian Persian sources at the same time don't say anything. If this guy was so important, how come they don't mention him? But no, I think he existed. But I think he devised a new religion in order to unite the warring Arabs, a new ideology here. I guess he could have become Christian, but then he would have had to probably be subservient to or join up with the Byzantine, the Eastern Roman Empire, which was, of course, the primary Christian power at that time. And he could have become Jewish, but there had been an earlier Jewish kingdom actually down in Yemen called the Himyarite Kingdom, which had been crushed by the Ethiopians, interestingly enough. The king of Ethiopia, who was Christian, had sent an army over and crushed them because they were persecuting Christians, interestingly enough. So I think, geopolitically, what's it make sense? Try to join up with something that exists, with an ideology or religion that already exists, an ideology or religion that's not really very powerful in the area, or come up with a new one of which you can become the leader and the prophet, and then wind up with 11 wives and, other fringe benefits, shall we say.
Sure. So as we talk about heresy, obviously there's a definition for that, and the earliest heresies typically revolved around the person and work of Jesus Christ. Who is Jesus? Was he fully God, fully man? And we know the first ecumenical councils and things dealt with the Arianism and Nestorianism and issues like that.
Gnosticism, yeah.
Sure, absolutely. When we get to the 7th century and we get to Islam, now we're dealing with what but again, you mentioned those who have identified Islam as a Christian heresy. What is it that they teach about Jesus that would be heretical? And is it similar to any of the previous heresies?
Mm-hmm. Well, the main Islamic teachings about Jesus are that he's just a man. Mm-hmm. He was born of a virgin. Islam does teach that. But he's just a man. He's a prophet. He is, in some ways, the greatest prophet, because according to the Quran, Jesus did miracles. Muhammad didn't do any miracles. Jesus, there are some accounts in the Quran of Jesus, healing them. They aren't as specific as in the Gospels, but it will mention like Jesus healed the blind or things like that, which, of course, none of which Muhammad did. Where Muhammad outranks Jesus, according to Islamic thinking, is he comes last, right? He's the Khatam al-Ali. Khatam al-Awliya, the seal of the saints. He is like I said earlier, he's the final messenger to mankind. And so therefore he thus, maybe not personally, but his message outranks that of Jesus because it's corrective to what Christians screwed up. But Jesus is a prophet. He's a great prophet. He did not die. The Quran, and then there's also ancillary data in what are called the hadiths. The hadiths are sayings of Muhammad's, and there's multi-volume collections of these things. There's like thousands or tens of thousands of them. And I had to deal with a bunch of them writing my doctoral dissertation, and kind of make your head hurt. But it's a whole corpus of data that adds on to what the Quran says. It is not as authoritative for Muslims as the Quran, because the Quran is believed to be literally the word of Allah, whereas the hadiths are the word of Muhammad. But it's sort of like 1 and 1A. It's pretty close. The problem with the hadiths, and even Muslims will tell you this, the experts in hadith, the muhaddithun, the experts in hadith, will tell you, the problem is they don't know which ones are legitimate and which ones aren't. And there's a ranking system for these things, basically reliable, good, and kind of unreliable. And the problem is Muslims don't know really which are which. Anyway, the data on Jesus comes mainly from the Quran, but there's also stuff about him in the hadiths. And so the Quran says flatly, Jesus did not die. He was taken to heaven. They thought they were crucifying him, and he was taken to heaven. I guess sort of like Elijah or something. And then one that was made to, it's kind of tricky how to translate the Arabic, but it says basically something along the lines of one that was made to look like him was crucified in his place. So somebody got crucified. It doesn't really explain who. Now, there's some further stuff in the hadiths where Muslims have identified that it was Judas. Judas was punished for betraying Jesus by actually being crucified, and Jesus was taken to heaven. And then it says again in other places in the Quran and the hadiths, Jesus will return. Jesus will return before the end of time, and getting to eschatology, but he'll come back and he will join up with the Mahdi, which literally means in Arabic the rightly guided one, the divinely guided one, who is a man and Muslims have their different beliefs, whether you're Sunni or Shia, about who exactly the Mahdi is. But whether it's Sunni or Shia, he does the same thing. He basically works with Jesus, the returned Jesus, to take over the world for Islam. And then they will establish a universal caliphate, planetary caliphate, and everything will be hunky-dory from an Islamic point of view. And then, but both of them are just men. I mean, Jesus and the Mahdi are just mortal men, just like Muhammad was, and they will eventually die. And then the Islamic Caliphate, the universal Islamic Caliphate will fall apart. And then later on, bad things will happen. And then the last judgment will come, but that's further down the road. But the main things about Jesus are
almost sounds like premillennialism in one sense. Jesus comes back, and then there's this millennium, and then but at the end there's going to be another battle and those things. Yeah,
right. Yeah, because Jesus coming back in the Mahdi doesn't fix things sort of like cosmically. It fixes things in history on this planet for a brief period of time, and it's fuzzy. Is it? Some of the hadiths say 7 years, some of the hadiths say 40 years, some give an indefinite period of time. It's millennial in the sense that there's a time frame on it, but it's not. But the actual 1,000-year millennium is not really operative in Islam. Sure. But that's the big thing. Jesus was not crucified. There's no Trinity, so he's not the Son of God. He's not the incarnation. He wasn't crucified, and he wasn't resurrected. So there's no atonement. So that's the big problem. This is where you see these things. Do Jews and Christians do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? Well, I would say, no, of course not. Because if that's true, then Allah sure can't make up his mind, because, the New Testament says Christ is crucified once for all for us and atoning for our sins, and he's resurrected, and he'll come again to judge the living and the dead. Well, the creed says that, but the Bible implies it, right? But the Quran says basically the opposite. No, he's just a man. Basically the real only points of agreement between the Quran and the Bible on this are that Jesus was indeed a real person, and he was born of a virgin, and he did some miracles. But those are all important, but they're not as important as the crucifixion and the incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection, all of which the Quran denies. And so there's no way we worship the same God.
Yeah, no, amen to that for sure. What do you think and I know this is this could do a whole nother podcast, but I had a few questions I thought of right before the show, and I this was one of the ones that was just would interest me. If I were to ask you, what do you think most people, and maybe the best way to say this is we'll start with Christians and then general people. What do you think most Christians misunderstand about Islam?
At this point in history, I think what most Christians misunderstand is just, I'm sorry, how intrinsically violent the teachings of Islam are. It just
So you
is.
think they deny
Jihad,
that? Yeah.
I think they have been, after 9/11, we started out talking about 9/11 quite a bit, very important thing. And everybody, far from these claims of Islam and Muslims being persecuted in America after 9/11, it's just been the opposite. Americans have bent over backwards to be welcoming and open to Muslims. I mean, so much they've been so open-minded about it, their brains have fallen out, as my wife often says about the ELCA.
Yeah.
I mean, before 9/11, there were about 900 mosques in America. Now there are over 3,000. By some counts, 3,500. Now, some of these are storefront mosques with 12 people, granted. But,
Yeah.
10 miles away from me in Alpharetta, Georgia, is a gigantic new mosque, Ottoman style. It's lovely to look at. The teachings come out of there might bother me a little bit. And again, let me make sure everybody understands, Pastor. Islam is violent. Does that mean all Muslims are violent? No. Most Muslims aren't. Here's the thing, however. If you go read the Quran and the 164 jihad verses in there, and the verses about, there may be some verses, there are some verses, I should say may, there are some verses in there, for instance, where it says Muhammad supposedly, or the Quran says, nearest to you in belief are the Christians, for instance, okay? But there are other verses that basically countermand that and overrule it. There's a passage in the Quran, surah means chapter, surah al-Tawbah, verses 9 and others. No, I'm sorry, surah al-Tawbah, which is surah 9, verse 29 and others, say basically to attack the unbelievers and force them to convert. And if you can't force them to convert, kill them. It basically says that. Now, what Muslim apologists will say is, well, that's balanced out by, as I said, these earlier verses which purport to say that you should be friends with Christians, except that Islam has this doctrine. There's a Quranic interpretation doctrine called naskh, N-A-S-K-H in Arabic, which means abrogation or supplanting or overruling. And naskh is a doctrine that the Muslims came up with many years ago because they had a problem. The satanic verses. That wasn't just a book by a Pakistani writer some years ago. What was that guy's name? The Satanic Verses. Salman Rushdie.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you remember this or not. I mean, this is back.
I remember the name. I don't remember.
Yeah. Salman Rushdie, who was a British Pakistani writer, wrote a fiction book called The Satanic Verses, and offended a lot of people and got a death penalty from the Ayatollah, and he had to go into hiding. And then somebody tried to kill him at one point. The Satanic Verses is a real thing. The Satanic Verses, there are passages, and I forget, I have to look it up, which chapter of the Quran it is, but, Muhammad started preaching in Mecca, and according to him, he had visions from either the angel Gabriel, or Allah himself didn't appear to him, but spoke to him. And then he was going out and preaching this. Excuse me. And he'd been doing this for a while. We're not sure exactly how long, some months or maybe longer in Mecca, and wasn't making much headway. And then suddenly one day Muhammad shows up and preaches, besides Allah, it's okay to worship a couple of other gods from the pre-Islamic Arab pantheon. Yeah. Allat, which is the feminine version of Allah. Anything that ends in T is feminine in Arabic. Al-Uzza and Al-Manat. There were like 3 other gods and goddesses you could worship besides Allah. And people were like, wait a minute. You've been preaching that there's only one God to worship. Now you're saying there's 4. Well, then Muhammad rapidly received another revelation. And this revelation said, that was not Allah or the angel Gabriel downloading to Muhammad. That was Satan. Iblis.
Oh, wow.
Satan. That's where the term satanic verses come from. So the Muslims have this problem because there are these passages right in the middle of the Quran that say, hey, it's okay to worship 3 other gods besides Allah. So much for that strict monotheism. Well, again, how do they explain that away? Because it wound up in the Quran. What they did, they came up with this doctrine of naskh, abrogation, which is that, stuff that alleged revelations that Muhammad received later in his life, chronologically, outweigh one's earlier. I'm like, well, right away I would be like, how do you believe that religion? Because you're saying the whole thing is the word of God. Now you're saying there's like a gradation. Okay.
Yeah.
No, some are more authoritative than others. I'm like, Anyway, so that's where they came up with this doctrine of Nosk to deal with that. It has since been applied to other things. Again, as I was getting at, it has been applied to this idea that, well, some outweigh the others. Well, here's the problem with that, though. The Surat al-Tawbah, the one I mentioned a minute ago, by most Muslim scholars is believed to be one of the last, if not the last, alleged revelation Muhammad received from Allah. So it outranks everything that came before it. And what does it say? Again, actually, hang on one second. I actually have the text here because I had it up in this other thing I was looking at. Fight those who do not believe in Allah or in the last day and who do not consider unlawful what Allah and his messenger have made unlawful. Fight them until they give the jizya willingly. That is, the jizya is the
statement of faith, right?
No, the jizya is the oppression tax. The shahada is a statement of faith. The jizya is what you do to Jews and Christians under Muslim rule. They have to pay a special tax and, ride on the back of the camel, and they have to know their place. And, it's basically second-class citizenship. That's the jizya tax. So, again, and this is how you wind up with all this jihadist terrorism, one of the main reasons, because what happens is ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all these other groups, what the reason it's almost impossible to delegitimize them is they say, look, we aren't doing anything. We're doing what the prophet said. We're doing exactly what that surah that I just read to you said to do. We're the good Muslims. You Muslims that aren't doing this are the bad Muslims. So that's why it's almost impossible to theologically refute these. I mean, Obama or I don't care, whoever, Pope Francis or anybody can trot out and say, well, that's not true Islam. Yeah, it is. Now, the good thing is most Muslims are like, I got better things to do with my life than worry about chopping somebody's head off. I got to make a living. I got to raise my kids. I don't have time for that stuff. But the problem is when there's 1.6, 1.8 billion people, if 1% of them believe that, help me, that's 16 to 18 million people. I'm a historian. I'm not good with numbers, but that's 16 to 18 million people. 1%.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. And we see the byproduct of that. We see the fruit of that around the world. And that you mentioned earlier that, the mosques are popping up everywhere. We have obviously I'm in Jacksonville, Florida. We have pretty large mosque on the other side of town. And I'm sure there's some other meeting areas around town, but that's the one that it has the domes on top and it's very ornate and obviously can be seen from the highway, very big. And I recently had a conversation with a Muslim. He actually visited our church because there was a person in our church who had befriended him at work and they had begun to talk about their faith. And he asked his friend, the person who comes to our church, could he just come and watch a service? And, so he did, and he sat the whole time. He did not participate in any act of worship. He didn't stand when we sang or anything like that, but he sat there. And afterwards he waited patiently because he wanted to talk to me. And when he talked to me, it was about a 2-hour conversation. I mean, he really wanted to dive into this. The person that had brought him had been having a conversation, and I really think that he was trying to take that person and show them that, Christianity was wrong, because the arguments he was making towards me were very, very argumentative. He wasn't ugly or rude, but certainly he came with a purpose. And one of the things that he said it was a surprise to me because I didn't realize why he would start with this. But he said, when we first sat down, he said, I don't understand why you believe what the Bible says about David sinning. David did not sin. He was a righteous man, and the things the Bible says about him are not true. He did not commit adultery. He did not have someone killed. And I only bring that up because that was a surprise to me that he would start with that
Hmm.
rather than, maybe the crucifixion of Jesus or something
Right.
else. It was his argument to me was the Bible lies about man's sin. Is this
Yeah.
something you've experienced?
Yeah. Well, no, not that David thing specifically, but I mean, that's a key approach of Muslims. I mean, what's one of their key tenets, as I said earlier, which is that the Bible is corrupted and
Hmm.
The Quran fixes. So he didn't believe the story about the biblical story about David. And yeah, I mean, there's also not original sin in Islam too. I guess the larger question is that there's not original sin. It's very much, you're going to go to heaven. It's very much a works righteousness religion. You're going to go to heaven by by performing the five pillars, shahada, the profession of faith, zakat, almsgiving, make the Hajj to Mecca once on your life if you can. The other, I need more coffee. But the five pillars, you have to practice the five pillars, and if you don't, salat, prayer 5 times a day, and what am I forgetting? Boy, sorry, middle of the afternoon.
It's okay.
But you have to perform those, and if you perform those for your whole life assiduously, and you go to mosque regularly, and you read the Quran and do all that stuff, you might get to heaven. Maybe depends on the whims of Allah. I mean, Allah might not bring you to heaven. He's rather capricious. You don't know for sure. But that's a major approach. Is that if the Quran agrees with the Bible, then they'll accept it. But born of a virgin, okay, they'll accept that. But they pretty much don't accept anything else about Jesus. And as I said, some miracles.
Yeah. So not only is there heresies related to the person and work of Christ, but also the nature of man, because they believe that men have that capacity within them to attain righteousness outside of the work of God through grace in the Lord Jesus Christ.
Right. There is no grace in Islam. There's just not. It's Allah is just not a very nice deity, to put it mildly.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, not I mean, nice in the sense of don't fall into the C.S. Lewis era there. Christianity is not just being nice, but he's not very. A better way to say it, I guess, he's not very loving or forgiving. I mean, again, there's no way of making sure you have any forgiveness in Islam. And really, forgiveness is not a major factor. It's obedience. The big thing is obedience. What does Islam mean, by the way? The word Islam means submission.
Mm-hmm.
Submit. You are Allah's slave, and you better mind your P's and Q's and do what you're told. I mean, you don't refer to Allah as Abba, Father. Nope, that doesn't happen. He's a distant deity who just he's the sinners in the hand of an angry God deity, and that's all he is, though.
Yeah.
That's it. There's nothing beyond that, and you better hope and pray that he, cut you some slack at the end, because there's no guarantee.
Gotcha. Well, and I think this might be a good place for us to draw in, because as a person who's an expert in this and who has dealt with people in various situations, obviously you've spoke to Muslims, you've translated, done things. Have you ever, in your time speaking to Muslim, have you ever found that there was a way that reaching them with the gospel seemed to be more effective? I know there's tons of people who talk about, if you're going to talk to Muslims, talk about this or talk about that or this. The day I sat with that Muslim for 2 hours, I kept pointing him back to his sin, pointing him back to his need for a savior. I kept pointing him back to the fact that if he faced God in his sin, none of the righteous deeds that he had done are going to atone for one of his sins. That was my point. But I didn't know if in your experience, have you had, this is something that has gotten their attention, maybe is the question.
The best thing is what, like you're saying, and then follow up by saying, there is one way of knowing that you're forgiven. It's by knowing Jesus and knowing that he was indeed crucified and resurrected for your sins. And that covers over your sins, not the need to follow all of the dictates of Islam and hope, the minuscule hope you have at the end of time, whenever judgment comes, that Allah will be merciful to you. I mean, it's funny because they keep, they refer to Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Allah the merciful, the benevolent. I'm like, he's not merciful at all. I don't see any acts of mercy anywhere in that Quran. So By the way, I'm curious, how did he respond when you told him that?
He would not he would not admit that his sin was worthy of condemnation. He
Mm.
said he believed himself to be a righteous man, and I kind of pulled a little bit of a Ray Comfort on him. Kind of started going through the commandments, talking about, have you done this? Have you broken this law? Have you broken this law? Trying to show him his sin, and it was always very diminished. His view of his own sin was, it's not. I'm not condemnable. Was kind of, I think, the way he saw himself.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, part of that is that Islamic triumphalism that, we have the right religion, we have the true God. I mean, I know we Christians fall into that sometimes, right? We have the right belief, we have the right doctrine. Pick your denomination. You're an expert on this. But
Yeah.
we got it right, and the rest of you guys don't.
Superior theology, it's right there.
There you go. Except, no cigar and no sweater vest. Well, maybe a cigar. No bourbon though. There's very much this idea that Muslims are inherently superior just based on the fact of being Muslim.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, you see a lot of that. Maybe some other day we can talk about this more, but you see that when Muslims come into countries, they come into these foreign countries. I just saw a video the other day. Was it Ireland? Ireland, they're bringing in all these Muslim immigrants, and they're complaining about the water and the food. And then there was a complaint. It was either England or Ireland that Muslims are offended that people are walking their dogs. And so therefore you need to stop walking your dog because it's right. I'm like, this is part of this triumphalist thing where, we are superior by virtue of being Muslims. And, it's not exactly what you're talking about, but I think it stems from that theology where everybody, where we go, you better kowtow to us because we are the superior human beings. And again, not just theologically, we're superior as human beings. But clearly, the basis for that, I think, is the theological claim that, I mean, it's kind of, it's almost schizophrenic in some ways. However, on one hand, our sins aren't really sins, and you particularly see this and again, you see this with what's gone on in England and this stuff about the rape gangs and so on and so forth. Boy, that'll get us flagged on YouTube, won't it?
It's okay.
You can't.
Yeah.
I mean, but that's what they are. That's what they were.
Yeah.
That's hopefully were, not are, but God willing. Anyway, this idea that sexual sins really aren't sins because we're Muslims. But on the other hand, if you actually read the Quran and look at it, because I think a lot of these people, they're like, I would say in some ways I'm not sure they actually read the Quran. They just go to the mosque on Friday and listen to what the imam says. And, he may not preach on the whole thing, probably doesn't. But on one hand, sins aren't that bad. On the other hand, Allah is not forgiving. Well, I know, I guess you could sort of reconcile that if you're a Muslim and say, well, my sins aren't that bad, so Allah doesn't have that much to forgive. But I think you're onto something there because Muslims aren't told they need they're inundated with sin and they have a sinful nature. I mean, that whole thing, again, going back to original sin, whatever you want to call it, original sin, ancestral sin, sinful nature, the old man. They're not taught there's an old man. They're like, the old man's fine.
Yeah. And that, again, goes right along with what we're talking about, the fact that that's a heretical view of man. It's a heretical view of God.
And it's incorrect view of man. Yeah, it's just not right. Yeah, you're right. It's heretical because it's incorrect, right?
That's right. Well, Dr. Furnish, I want to thank you for coming on the show today, and I'll give you a minute or two if you have anything you want to add, any thoughts as we draw to a close, or anything you want to tell people about. Maybe you have a website or something that you'd like to point people to. I'd like to give you that opportunity as we get ready to draw to a close here.
Well, thanks, Pastor. I would just say, again, keep in mind, I'm not saying that all Muslims are terrorists. Mm-hmm. I'm saying that Islam, if you wish to commit jihad, wage jihad, wage it. I mean, Muhammad himself did. Most Islamic leaders throughout history, one of the criteria for being an Islamic leader was the ability to lead jihads. So that, and then violence against non-Muslims, the idea that non-Muslims should come under the sway of Islam. willingly or unwillingly. That's all in the Quran. That's not something made up. That's not something that was foisted upon Islam by people that don't like Islam. It's there. And, go read it for yourself. And by the way, speaking of reading it for yourself, look at, if you want, I'm a regular writer over at The Stream, which is a conservative and Christian site. Conservative Christians, we have, Protestant, Catholic writers. I think there's one or two Orthodox people that write there, but it's basically conservative folks in the Christian world right there. It's political. It's not just religious. And I think I just had my 152nd article over there last week. So if you want to look at my stuff, you go over to The Stream, and there's a lot of other good stuff there too. So I would highly recommend taking a look at that.
Well, good deal. Well, I'll be happy to link anything in the description if you want to send me something. I am going to link the article that we talked about earlier, because I'm sure people will be interested in reading.
Yeah, that was at The Stream, so that's good. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again. Thank you. Also, I know this sounds funny, but thank your family for giving us to you for this, or giving you to us for the last hour or so. And I appreciate you taking the time of being with me.
Thank you, Pastor. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir. I want to thank you guys for being a part of the show today. I want to remind you again that one of the ways that you can help support the show is simply by subscribing to the channel. If you haven't done so, you can just go down and hit that button. And if you like this episode, hit the thumbs up button. If you didn't, hit the thumbs down button twice. Thanks again for listening to Your Calvinist Podcast. My name is Keith Foskey, and I've been your Calvinist. May God bless you.
Sometimes I feel the weight of the world fall down on me, and I need a friendly voice with some good theology. So I mix a manly drink, then I hit the YouTube link, and I feel my troubles all melt away. Oh, it's Your Calvinist Podcast with Keith Foskey. Beards and bow ties, laughs till sunrise. It's Your Calvinist Podcast with Keith Foskey. He's not like most Calvinists, he's nice.
Your Calvinist Podcast with Keith Foskey, striving for superior theology and denominational unity, one joke at a time.